First oral question, Baroness Pidgeon.
I beg leave to ask the question standing in my name on the order paper.
As part of the Government's plan for change, the creation of Great British Railways will unify track and train to deliver better services for passengers, increase revenue and reduce the cost of the railway. Whilst GBR will lead in delivering a customer-focused experience for passengers, we are committed to establishing a powerful passenger watchdog alongside it to champion their interests. My department will publish a consultation on the Railways Bill imminently, which will provide detail on our plans to establish a passenger standards authority.
My Lords, passengers have faced fewer, shorter, overcrowded trains and increased fares for too long. Will the new Passenger Standards Authority actually have enforcement powers and oversee a new charter for passengers confirming the minimum level of service that all new publicly owned lines will guarantee?
We've been working hard to ensure that the new PSA will be a powerful watchdog, making sure passengers have the independent voice in the industry that stands up for them. It will have increased powers, enabling it to become a strong advocate through holding GBR to account for improving the passenger experience, and particularly for disabled people, as discussed during the passage of the Public Ownership Bill. The public consultation I referred to will seek views of the public and industry on the proposed scope and functions of the PSA. After the consultation is published, I will be happy to meet the Noble Baroness and other interested Lords to discuss it.
The Government is establishing a passenger transport standards authority, but Network Rail says the industry should not use the word passenger. Who's right?
The document that the Noble Lord refers to was, I think, actually published in the time he was the Secretary of State for Transport. By Network Rail, I should say, and it's not a recent document. It's advice about writing letters with words of less than 4 syllables in them, actually it's quite good advice, because much of the correspondence he must have been given in his time as Secretary of State, that I'm given as the Minister and which I was given as the Chair of Network Rail, was indigestible in practical terms, and a guide to people about how to write letters in simple English is a really good thing.
My Lords, the previous government introduced changes which led to reduced services, to a higher cost for the passenger. Can the Minister say what that has cost the taxpayer? Has he got any estimates about the changes they brought about that failed for railway reorganisation?
I can't easily find that number referred to by my noble friend, but it is true that, for example, the failure to resolve the wages issues for the principal trade unions led to the most prolonged national dispute in railway history and cost the taxpayer and the customers about £800 million.
Can the Minister just remind the House, because I'm sure he knows the figure, what the passenger numbers were before privatisation and what they were at the last time before the COVID outbreak, what the rise in passenger numbers over that time have been?
I'm sure if I can't remember, the Noble Lord will be able to remember. but he's right. Roughly they doubled, and they doubled because at the time of privatisation there was a huge amount of white space in the timetable. It is acknowledged fact that the early years of privatisation particularly produced more and a better train service, partially at least because the old British Rail was starved of investment. But we're not dealing with the railway that is in that position now. We're dealing in a railway that doesn't have the numbers that it had before COVID. It doesn't have the revenue it had before COVID, but it still has all of the costs.
My Lord, could the Minister reflect on the fact that the increase in traffic was very substantially driven by firstly the economic boom under the last Labour government, but also in the increase in population?
Yeah.
I thank my noble friend for that too. He is, of course, right. It's quite hard to distinguish what's going on the railway from the general economy, principally because connectivity drives growth, jobs and housing. and he's right about both of those features. But in respect to the railway itself, the principal feature I would draw attention to is the one I did in the last question, which is to say if you have a lot of white space in the timetable, you can run more trains at relatively marginal cost. That white space on many, many parts of the railway no longer exists.
Lords, you wait a long time for one Secretary of State for Transport and then three come along at once. Can the Minister confirm that the Government remains totally committed to the principle of open access on the railways?
It's always a pleasure to see so many ex-Secretaries of State on the other side of the House, all of whom I have respect for, and one of whom at least appointed me to the last job. The Secretary of State's recent letter, which was made public, sets out precisely what the conditions are in which open access is an asset to the railway and not a detraction. And one of the things that we have to be very careful about is that if inadvertently revenue that would otherwise accrue to the public person reduced to subsidy is diverted, then actually that may not be a good deal for the taxpayers. I'm sure the Noble Lord has read that letter, and I would refer him to it as a very accurate description of the conditions under which open access is a good thing and the conditions under which it isn't.
The authority have any ability to engage with the companies about the new East Coast Main Line timetable, given that it involves halving the service of trains to London from Berwick-on-Tweed and making the journey time longer?
We'll see when the time comes whether the new Passenger Standards Authority is set up in time to deal with that question. But I'm glad the Noble Lord raised the question of the East Coast Main Line timetable, because it is one of the justifications for having a guiding mind for the railway. Our nation invested over £4 billion in upgrading the East Coast Main Line, and it's taken several years to be able to achieve a situation where a timetable which is remotely acceptable to all the operators and the passengers, even though it has detractions in some places, was capable of being put into effect. And it's a startling exposition of the fact that there is no controlling mind, that the person in the end who took the decision to put that timetable in was me.
Lords, the last thing when the consultation document on the future of the railways is published, which I hear might even be in the course of this week, is the Noble Lord the Minister persuaded that it will have a convincing explanation of how Great British Railways is going to reconcile the inherent conflict of interest that exists between its role as a passenger service operator on the one hand and its position as a strategic authority allocating paths and resources to freight, open access operators and others, some of them in direct competition with it? Or is that the issue which has been holding it up, its publication up for so long?
The Noble Lord is right. I promised him it would be ready in December. I was advised by a colleague here too that I didn't say which December, of course. But in fact, as I said, it will be imminent. The question that he asks is germane in a mixed-use railway, and it's not a question unique to this network at all. It's a question which in various forms has been a question for all railway operators for as long as there's been freight passengers, express passengers and so on. And it is clear that that a controlling mind will have to have some criteria to allocate access, and that criteria will have to form the basis of decision making. It's also clear that because there are third parties on the railway, they should have a right of appeal. The document that I'm referring to, which will be published imminently, will deliver a proposed solution to those issues.
Well, Lords, the last thing I would want to do is create problems for one of our ministers, particularly this minister. But he will recall the good days of the old Caledonian sleepers, including one that came from Stranraer all the way down to London, which was used by many of our colleagues from Northern Ireland and very effectively.
Recently, under the auspices of the unfortunate auspices of the Scottish Government, the Caledonian sleepers are really terrible and making a huge loss. What advice would he give to the Scottish Government, and would he consider perhaps even taking over the Caledonian sleepers and integrating them into Great British Rail?
I would not propose to take anything over from the Scottish Government. They're quite capable of running their railway themselves. The sleeper from Stranraer was abandoned some 15 years ago. It was also a sleeper from Barrow, Furness and other places. And the purpose of sleeper trains is to afford overnight travel. And I think actually the Caledonian sleeper, now operated by ScotRail itself, does rather well at it. I doubt it's particularly profitable, but certainly in the view of the Scottish Government, it must be worth running because they run it.
Second oral question.